안녕하세요. 이번 영상에서는 어근, 접두사 등을 이용하여 몇 가지 중요 어휘들을 알아볼게요. 이 단어는 뜻이 어떻게 될까요?
perceive, perceive, perceive.
이 단어의 접두사는 통하여 철저히 위 의미를 가지고 어근이 잡다위 의미를 가지므로 이 단어 어원의 문자적 의미를 경험, 감각기관 등을 통하여 철저히 감을 잡다로 풀이할 수 있고 여기서 감지하다, 파악하다, 인식하다라는 의미가 나와요.
The word perceive originates from the Latin verb percipere, which is a combination of the prefix per, meaning through or thoroughly, and a form of the root capere, meaning to take, to grasp, or to hold. The form capere becomes cipere in percipere due to a phonetic process called assimilation, which makes it easier to pronounce with the prefix per. The word perceive has two main meanings. 1. To become aware of something through the senses. This pertains to sensory perception such as seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, or touching. Example: I perceived a change in the room's temperature. 2. To understand or interpret something. This involves mental processing, interpretation, or comprehension of information or situations. Example: They perceived his decision to step down as an admission of guilt. Perceive, perceive, perceive.
감지하다, 파악하다, 인식하다.
Perceive, perceive, perceive.
감지하다, 파악하다, 인식하다. 다음, 이 단어는 뜻이 어떻게 될까요?
Perception, perception, perception.
이 단어에는 앞서 본 단어에 들어있는 접두사, 그 단어가 유래한 라틴어 어근의 과거분사형, 그리고 명사와 전미사가 들어있어요. 라틴어는 동사의 과거분사형을 기초로 명사형을 만드는 경우가 많았는데 라틴어의 어원을 둔 이 단어에도 그 흔적이 남아있어요. 이 단어는 어원의 문자적 의미를 경험, 감각기관 등을 통하여 철저히 감이 잡아지게 하는 것 또는 감이 잡아진 것으로 풀어볼 수 있고 여기에서 감지 능력, 파악 능력, 인식 능력, 인식, 지각이라는 의미가 생겨나요.
The sept in perception comes from ceptus, which is the past participle of the Latin verb capere. The Latin verb capere means to take, to grasp, or to hold, and its past participle form, ceptus, implies something that has been taken, grasped, or held. Perception, perception, perception.
감지 능력, 파악 능력, 인식 능력, 인식, 지각.
Perception, perception, perception.
감지 능력, 파악 능력, 인식 능력, 인식, 지각. 다음, 이 단어는 뜻이 어떻게 될까요?
Perceptual, perceptual, perceptual.
이 단어에는 바로 앞에서 본 단어에서 명사와 전미사 대신 무엇무엇과 관련된 무엇무엇의 성격을 지닌 윗뜻을 나타내는 형용사와 전미사가 들어있어요. 이 단어 어원의 문자적 의미는 경험, 감각기관 등을 통하여 철저히 감이 잡아지게 하는 것과 관련된으로 풀어볼 수 있고 여기에서 감지 능력과 관련된 지각의 지각적인 이 의미가 도출돼요.
The word perceptual generally means relating to the ability to interpret or become aware of something that is perceived through the senses. It often refers to the way our brain interprets sensory input to create our perception of the world around us. Perceptual, perceptual, perceptual.
감지 능력과 관련된 지각의 지각적인
Perceptual, perceptual, perceptual.
감지 능력과 관련된 지각의 지각적인. 다음,
Perceptive, perceptive, perceptive.
이 단어는 바로 앞에서 본 단어와는 전미사 부분만 달라요. 이 단어에 들어있는 전미사도 형용사와 전미사이긴 한데 어떤 능력 또는 경향을 지닌 윗뜻을 나타내는 전미사예요. 결국 이 단어 어원의 문자적 의미는 경험, 감각기관 등을 통하여 철저히 감이 잡아지게 하는 능력을 지닌으로 풀어볼 수 있고 여기에서 통찰력이 있는, 잘 감지하는, 지각력이 뛰어난이라는 의미가 생겨나요.
A perceptive person is someone who is sharp, observant, and insightful. They are able to pick up on subtle cues and details that others miss. A perceptive person is someone who is intelligent, thoughtful, and discerning. They are able to see things from different perspectives and understand the underlying meaning of things. Perceptive, perceptive, perceptive.
통찰력이 있는, 잘 감지하는, 지각력이 뛰어난.
Perceptive, perceptive, perceptive.
통찰력이 있는, 잘 감지하는, 지각력이 뛰어난. 다음, 이 단어는 뜻이 어떻게 될까요?
Misperception, misperception, misperception.
이 단어에는 앞에서 본 인식, 지각이라는 뜻을 가진 명사 앞에 잘못된, 잘못되게 윗뜻을 지닌 접두사가 들어있으니까 이 단어의 어원으로부터 잘못된 인식, 오해라는 의미가 도출돼요.
misperception, misperception, misperception,
잘못된 인식, 오해.
misperception, misperception, misperception,
잘못된 인식, 오해. 다음, 이 단어는 뜻이 어떻게 될까요?
vulnerable, vulnerable, vulnerable,
이 단어의 앞부분은 상처를 입게 하다 라는 뜻을 지닌 라틴어 어근에서 유래하고 뒷부분은 가능성 및 수동의 의미를 부여하는 형용사와 전미사이므로 이 단어 어원의 문자적 의미는 상처를 입을 수 있는 이 되고 여기에서 취약한, 상처 입기 쉬운, 공격받기 쉬운 이 의미가 생겨나요. 이 단어 중 라틴어 어근에서 유래한 부분의 철자와 이에 해당하는 영어 단어의 철자를 비교해보세요. 좀 닮은 구석이 보이시나요? 이 단어가 유래한 라틴어 어근은 벌어진 상처를 연상하면 그 의미를 기억하는 데 도움이 될 수 있어요. 벌어진 상처, 벌러 상처,
vulnerable,
벌어진 상처, 벌러 상처.
vulnerable. The word vulnerable refers to a state of being open to physical or emotional harm. It describes a situation where an individual, group, or system is exposed to potential danger, damage, or harm, and may not be adequately equipped to defend against it. For example, in the sentence, she is vulnerable to the virus, the term vulnerable signifies that she is more susceptible to contracting the virus, perhaps due to a weakened immune system, lack of vaccination, or exposure to a high-risk environment. Her vulnerability increases the likelihood of her contracting the virus. Similarly, in the sentence, he is emotionally vulnerable, vulnerable indicates that he is susceptible to emotional hurt or distress. The word vulnerable can be applied to various contexts, encompassing physical, emotional, and even systemic vulnerabilities. It highlights the susceptibility to harm or danger and the potential consequences if adequate protection or resilience is lacking. Vulnerable, vulnerable, vulnerable,
취약한, 상처 입기 쉬운, 공격받기 쉬운.
vulnerable, vulnerable, vulnerable,
취약한, 상처 입기 쉬운, 공격받기 쉬운. 이 단어는 자주같이 쓰이는 전치사와 함께 꾸러미로 기억해두세요.
vulnerable to, vulnerable to, vulnerable to,
어디어디에 취약한,
vulnerable to, vulnerable to, vulnerable to,
어디어디에 취약한. 다음, 이 단어는 뜻이 어떻게 될까요?
vulnerability, vulnerability, vulnerability,
이 단어는 바로 앞에서 본 단어의 명사와 전미사가 결합되어 취약성, 약점의 의미를 나타내요.
vulnerability, vulnerability, vulnerability,
취약성, 약점,
vulnerability, vulnerability, vulnerability,
취약성, 약점. 다음,
invulnerable, invulnerable, invulnerable,
이 단어는 앞에서 본 취약한이라는 뜻을 가진 단어 앞에 부정, 반대를 나타내는 접두사가 붙어 있으니까 취약하지 않는, 상처를 입지 않는, 피해를 입지 않는이라는 의미가 돼요.
invulnerable, invulnerable, invulnerable,
취약하지 않는, 상처를 입지 않는, 피해를 입지 않는.
invulnerable, invulnerable, invulnerable,
취약하지 않는, 상처를 입지 않는, 피해를 입지 않는.
invulnerable to, invulnerable to, invulnerable to,
어디어디에 취약하지 않는, 무엇무엇으로 상처를 입지 않는, 무엇무엇으로 피해를 입지 않는.
invulnerable to, invulnerable to, invulnerable to,
어디어디에 취약하지 않는, 무엇무엇으로 상처를 입지 않는, 무엇무엇으로 피해를 입지 않는. 다음,
invulnerability, invulnerability, invulnerability,
이 단어는 바로 앞에서 본 단어의 명사와 전미사가 결합되어 있어 면역성, 내성, 부상을 입지 않음, 해를 입지 않음의 의미를 나타내요.
invulnerability, invulnerability, invulnerability,
면역성, 내성, 부상을 입지 않음, 해를 입지 않음.
invulnerability, invulnerability, invulnerability,
면역성, 내성, 부상을 입지 않음, 해를 입지 않음. 이제 위에서 다룬 어휘들을 연속하여 들으면서 그 의미를 다시 짐작해보고 쉐도잉 훈련도 해보도록 해요.
perceive, 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 perception, 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 perceptual, 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 perceptive, 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 misperception, 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 vulnerable, 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 vulnerable to, vulnerable to, vulnerable to, vulnerability, 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 invulnerable, 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 invulnerable to, invulnerable to, invulnerable to, invulnerability, 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 similar, 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 dissimilar, 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 similar to, similar to, similar to, similarity, 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 similarly, 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 likewise, 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 assimilate, 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 assimilation, 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 step down, step down, step down. He stepped down from his position due to personal reasons. He stepped down from his position due to personal reasons. He stepped down from his position due to personal reasons. Guilt, guilt, guilt. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Admit, admit, admit. He frankly admitted his mistake. He frankly admitted his mistake. He frankly admitted his mistake. The hospital admitted him with a suspected case of stroke. The hospital admitted him with a suspected case of stroke. The hospital admitted him with a suspected case of stroke. Admission, admission, admission. The committee granted her admission to the program. The committee granted her admission to the program. The committee granted her admission to the program. It may be perceived as an admission of guilt. It may be perceived as an admission of guilt. It may be perceived as an admission of guilt. Refer to, refer to, refer to. Subtle, subtle, subtle. Pick up, pick up, pick up. Cue, cue, cue. Discerning, discerning, discerning. Perspective, perspective, perspective. She is vulnerable to the virus. She is vulnerable to the virus. She is vulnerable to the virus. He is emotionally vulnerable. He is emotionally vulnerable. He is emotionally vulnerable. Susceptible to, susceptible to, susceptible to. Susceptibility, susceptibility, susceptibility. Immune, immune, immune. Immune to, immune to, immune to. Immune system, immune system, immune system. Lack, lack, lack. He lacks confidence in his abilities. He lacks confidence in his abilities. He lacks confidence in his abilities. They were fired for lack of skills required for the job. They were fired for lack of skills required for the job. They were fired for lack of skills required for the job. We will sign a contract with a new supplier. We will sign a contract with a new supplier. We will sign a contract with a new supplier. The economy contracted this year. The economy contracted this year. The economy contracted this year. They contracted a virus while traveling. They contracted a virus while traveling. They contracted a virus while traveling. They contracted out the work to a local company. They contracted out the work to a local company. They contracted out the work to a local company. Distress, distress, distress. Resilience, resilience, resilience. Expose, expose, expose. They were afraid to expose their weaknesses. They were afraid to expose their weaknesses. They were afraid to expose their weaknesses. Exposed to, exposed to, exposed to. They are exposed to lawsuits. They are exposed to lawsuits. They are exposed to lawsuits. The phrase, they are exposed to lawsuits, means that they are at risk of being sued. Exposure, exposure, exposure. Compass, circumference, a circumscribed space, boundary, range, scope. Compass, circumference, a circumscribed space, boundary, range, scope. Encompass, encompass, encompass. Our product line encompasses a wide variety of items from electronics to home goods. Our product line encompasses a wide variety of items from electronics to home goods. Our product line encompasses a wide variety of items from electronics to home goods. Thanks for watching.